Jerry, after such a long time, and thank you all for taking some of your time to come and meet me here this afternoon. The United States and Oman signed their first treaty of amity in 1833. The Sultan of the time, Sultan Saeed bin Sultan, sent a diplomatic envoy to this country, and he was received in New York in 1840. And an American consulate first opened in Muscat in 1880. Exactly 100 years later, in 1980, we signed what was then, for the region, a groundbreaking military access agreement. The Soviet Union was in Afghanistan, the Carter Doctrine newly in force. The challenges may change over time, but the core principles of our policy, of our Omani policy, remains the same. Respect for the rule of law, for the UN system, and for the UN Charter and the principles it reflects. We also have a strong preference for quiet diplomacy because we find it the best way to get results, which is why you would probably won't be hearing sensitive specifics from me during this talk. We believe in non-interference, and in particular, the pursuit of good relations with all of our neighbors, which is why I have chosen as my title for today, Love Your Neighbor. I thought I should start by having a look at what some of the great religions say about this. Love your neighbor as yourself. This, Jesus tells one of the scribes at the Temple of Jerusalem in the Gospel according to Mark, is the second of the two commandments that everyone should follow. And it is worth noting that this command goes further than the requirement that we should love our neighbor. It requires that we should love them in the same way as we love ourselves. It seems the aim of this demand is that we should always struggle not just to assist our neighbor, to offer them food, clothing, shelter whenever they are in need, but to live as though we were them. Above all, to see the world through their eyes. An almost identical demand appears throughout the key sacred texts of Islam. For example, in the Sahih Muslim collection of the Hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, you can read, "None of you have faith until you love for your neighbor what you love for yourself." Once again, the neighbor appears not just as the person who should be loved, but as the person through whose eyes we should seek to understand the world. And Rabbi Akiva, born not long after the passing of Jesus, is quoted by the Jerusalem Talmud as saying, "Love your neighbor as yourself. This is the great principle of the Torah." Now, what does this have to do with foreign policy? Well, stripped of its ethical or sacred connotations, it might mean something like this. always start from the assumption that you and your neighbor share the same fundamental interests. We do, after all, share the same planet. I'm aware that this might seem to fly in the face of many orthodox accounts of international relations, which assume what is called a realist attitude on the part of global actors like states. In this realist approach, states pursue what they see, rightly or wrongly, as their own interests, which will compete or even come into direct conflict with the interests of their neighbors. The successful foreign policy is therefore the one which obtains maximum gains for you, according to the realist logic, and losses for the other. This is a zero-sum game. A different approach, more consistent, if I may suggest, with the command to love your neighbor, would be one in which no negotiation is ever seen as a zero-sum game. You enter the process not seeking to maximize gains in line with your own perception of your own interests, but by seeking to understand the interests of your neighbor. What does he want? How might what he wants be compatible with what I want? Is there some solution to this problem that neither of us have yet thought of, that might turn out to work better for both of us? The zero-sum approach proceeds from an analysis of your own interests. You don't need to talk to anyone else to know what they are. You can just proceed to advance and secure your own interests. The alternative is to put your own interest to one side for a moment and start with your neighbor's interests. This is the key. The only way to love your neighbor, the only way to see the world as though you were your neighbor, is by finding out what your neighbor really wants and what your neighbor really thinks about. The answer, therefore, always starts with a dialogue. And dialogue starts with listening. It may sound strange to say that the Gulf today faces its most profound crisis for 30 years. After all, have we not witnessed innumerable acute crises over the last 38 years or so? The Iraq-Iran war, the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, the American invasion of Iraq and its aftermath, the dispute between Iran and the West over Iran's nuclear program. Why say that the crisis now is more acute than before? What I mean when I say this is that I think the present situation may involve a restructuring and a reorganization of regional relationships, after which the Gulf, my neighborhood, will be configured in new and as yet unpredictable way. The earlier crisis may turn out to have prepared the way for these reconfigurations. Until now, the basic architectural structure of Gulf security has remained more or less intact, even if it has sustained some damage. Now, I think it may be in a process of transformation. I would like to focus on three aspects of regional architecture. The first is what I would call the logic of containment. During the 1990s, containment, sometimes articulated by American policymakers as dual containment, emerged as the name for a general approach to the Gulf region, led by the United States, but broadly shared by their allies in the region. Dual containment referred to the attempt by the United States to limit the capacity of Iran and Iraq to threaten the stability of the region. But it was really only a variation on a more overarching US approach, primarily focused on Iran as the principal threat to regional stability. Iraq under Saddam Hussein emerged only relatively briefly as the clear threat. After all, it had been a de facto ally of the US and the West until 1990, and after the overthrow of Saddam Hussein in 2003, became so again. Iran, however, had been seen as a threat to American interests fairly continuously since the revolution of 1979. And this threat perception was widely shared in the region. Iran, in this view, was in the business of exporting the revolution and establishing or destabilizing, actually, the neighboring states. But in Oman's view, this analysis became less persuasive over time. From around 1989, it seemed to us Iran was engaged on a different path, open to a rapprochement with the United States and keen to become part of a regional status quo, in which it would not challenge the political status of its neighbors and in which it could pursue a kind of post-revolutionary normality. After all, let us not forget that Iran has a long track record as a strong and effective US ally, policeman of the Gulf for fully 20 years before the revolution. In the early 1990s, following the liberation of Kuwait from Iraqi occupation, we were optimistic that Iran might be included in a comprehensive new structure for regional security and stability. We believed that Iran's restraint during the war to liberate Kuwait was a clear sign of its readiness to engage. But the policy of containment prevailed. Iran continued to be seen as a threat, as something outside the regional order, as though it was not, in fact, a neighbor at all, but an intruder. No serious attempt was made to integrate Iran into a regional security structure. The idea of containment was that Iran's ambitions to wider political influence had to be opposed, and that its influence in places like Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine had to be challenged and reduced. Whatever one's view of Iran's real interests and intentions, it clearly now looks as though this approach has failed. The only success story is the story of the joint comprehensive plan of action negotiated with Iran by the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council and Germany, and brought into force by UN Resolution 2231. And this was not the product of containment at all, but the product of precisely the kind of active engagement in dialogue that the policy of containment tended to exclude. The second element of the regional architecture is closely related to, but by no means identical with the logic of containment, and that is the Gulf Cooperation Council. The GCC played a role in the maintenance of containment. Formed in 1981, it was, at least in part, a response to the sense of regional insecurity created by the Iranian Revolution of 1979. It is perhaps ironic, but also, given what I have said about containment, somewhat inevitable that attitudes toward Iran, which played this role in the formation of the GCC, seem today to be a factor in its current crisis. Oman has always been a strong supporter of intensified cooperation, especially on security issues between members of the GCC. As is also well known, we have reservations about efforts to move towards a closer political and economic union, and we have made our position on this very clear. But our reluctance to participate in future union, which is in any case hardly an issue at present, does not signal any rejection of the GCC as such, nor any desire to leave it. In fact, we have long been a supporter of the idea that the GCC should be expanded and its security dimension strengthened by Yemeni membership. This is also hardly an issue at present for depressingly obvious reasons. The dispute within the organization over Qatar and sharply divergent positions regarding the crisis in Yemen are compounded by the lack of dialogue. Oman would much prefer to see a conversation among all members of the GCC, and I say all members, with all of them, not just some, through which some of the present problems might be resolved. We want to see the organization enhanced and strengthened. This is, after all, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and without dialogue, there can be no cooperation. Indeed, the current crisis within the GCC is unprecedented because it undermines the very logic upon which the organization was first founded. The final and third aspect of the regional architecture of the past 3 to 4 decades is perhaps a little less obviously architectural. Instead, it might be regarded as a kind of cement that helped hold certain structures together and in place, but which has been eroding over the years. And I'm talking here about a historical sense of what we call Arab solidarity. Arab solidarity that shaped the way regional governments organized their conversations over the years. These conversations included, of course, those that took place within the Arab League, as well as attempt to forge other alliances either in parallel to or in collaboration with the GCC. And I'm talking or thinking here of the relatively short-lived Arab Cooperation Council, which fell apart very soon after its formation as a result of what was at the time perhaps the single most radical rejection of Arab solidarity, Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. And I'm also thinking of the attempt following the liberation of Kuwait to extend the security apparatus of the GCC into agreement which would include Egypt and Syria. This attempt, based on the Damascus Declaration of 1991 and its failure, may, with the comfort of hindsight, be regarded as an early indication that Arab solidarity would no longer be sufficient to guarantee regional security. At the time, of course, Oman would have preferred a solution based, we might say, on neighborhood solidarity, rather than Arab solidarity, in recognition of the fact that Iran had a more pressing stake in the security of the Gulf than did either Egypt or Syria. Of course, Arab solidarity during this period had a great deal to do with Palestine and a collective sense of responsibility and support for the Palestinian people and their representatives in their struggle for statehood and for self-determination and an end to Israeli occupation. This core motivating idea, which had been powerful and compelling for several decades, really suffered badly from Saddam Hussein's attempt to link it to his occupation of Kuwait. Even Syria, formerly one of the states most committed to a strong conception of Arab solidarity, chose not to accede to this logic and opposed Iraq's action. The PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, caught in an impossible predicament as a result of the poisoned chalice of what happened and what took place of the Saddam's linkage, inevitably lost friends elsewhere in the Arab world as a result of its compromised position. Despite the modest gains initially made as a result of the Madrid and then Oslo processes, the cause of Palestinian statehood appears to have suffered grave setbacks. I am not concerned to apportion blame to any of the parties involved. My point is simply to note that there is today perhaps less optimism, less resolve, and less collective energy in the idea of collective Arab solidarity in support of Palestine. One might say that Arab solidarity has suffered a fate very like that experienced by the logic of containment. But whatever the fate of Arab solidarity, the establishment of a Palestinian state remains a strategic necessity for the whole world. Terrorism and extremism will prosper in its absence. After the horrors of the Second World War, it was recognized by world opinion that the Jewish people needed a national home. So after 50 years or so of conflict in the Middle East, we believe world opinion understands the need for the Palestinians to have a home they can call their own. Containment failed, Arab solidarity has weakened. And as to the GCC, well, the future is clearly in doubt. In managing these very considerable challenges, we are firmly committed to inclusivity, to the so-called big tent and the big picture. How can you have regional stability if major players in the region are excluded from the conversation? And how can a zero-sum game make sense when we share a single planet? So, if we are to keep tensions to a minimum, we should avoid the zero-sum game mentality and pay attention to loving our neighbors. I don't mean that we should simply be good to one another, but rather, as in the Gospel according to Mark, as in the Sahih Muslim, and in the words of Rabbi Akiva, love your neighbor as yourself. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Syed Badr, for an incredibly rich presentation and a review of Oman's very unique, I would say, and a very significant role that you've played in a number of issues over the years and continue to play today as we look at the possibility of a confrontation with Iran, as we look at the effort we heard from Martin Griffiths the other day in New York, the possibility that there'll be a new push for a negotiated solution to the Yemen conflict. We had Secretary Pompeo in the region, notable that the first weekend as Secretary of State he spent traveling throughout the Middle East, talking about many of the issues that you just mentioned in your presentation. And so I guess the question that I have, looking at this from an Omani perspective, and I think that Oman's record is very consistent with your theme of love your neighbor and keeping your dialogue going with all of your neighbors. What do you see really as the way forward in the Gulf? I think that there is a growing concern, growing speculation on the part of many American commentators that we're heading for a confrontation between the Arab world and Iran, also between Israel and Iran and Syria. How does Oman see a way forward in opening up a dialogue at a time when so many people seem to be closing the windows?
Thank you, Jerry. I just, in my presentation, wanted first to remind everyone and remind ourselves, really, of the history and the historic context that we have been dealing with. And it always helps to understand the present if we just go and backtrack a bit on the sequence of events that took place over the years. And again, I think history tells us that as far as at least that region is concerned, dialogue is the key issue. If we break dialogue and there is no conversation, then conflict erupts, mistrust erupts, and so nobody really wants that kind of thing. And so in answering your question, I still think that nobody really in our region should sort of prefer the course of confrontation. We need to engage with each other. We need to engage with our adversaries. So if we have a problem with a country like Iran, we should engage and talk and consult and negotiate an understanding where we can build trust and mutual respect, because whether we like it or not, that country is a neighbor. It will remain to be a neighbor forever. And so at some point, one has to come to terms with that reality and deal with it through peaceful means. And I even really dare say that even if if Iran is perceived to be a threat for the security, let's say, of Israel, the question is, how do we deal with that? Mm-hmm. We discovered, through my talk at least, that containment didn't really work. So I think only by negotiation and engagement and dialogue, we can really mitigate that threat and bring everybody on the same platform and the same understanding where we can all live together and work together for the sake of stability for all and security for all.
So one of the questions, and I think historically, again, Oman is one of the very few governments where we have a very close relationship, and yet at the same time, you have a very close relationship with the Iranians. You have an ability to go to Tehran and meet with senior Iranian officials to work with them on some of the issues. One of the concerns that people have is that we've all heard what Foreign Minister Zarif has said. We've all seen what President Rouhani has said. Very positive things, very committed to a regional understanding along the lines of what you've talked about. And yet, at the same time, we see an Iran that's very aggressive in places like Yemen, very aggressive in terms of their interaction with the U.S. Navy in the Gulf, certainly very aggressive in Syria. And so the question is, when we talk to the Iranians, when we negotiated the nuclear deal with the Iranians successfully, were we really able to talk to the Iranians who count, who are making the decisions on some of these issues, like Yemen, or are we only talking to a facade, a front of Iran that is amenable to, open to negotiation, and yet at the back there are people who are making decisions that are very aggressive, very threatening to their neighbors?
Well, the way we look at this very much simply, you talk to Iran, you talk to the leaders of Iran, and they represent, their policy. I mean, in every country nowadays, there are those who are more aggressive than those who are perceived more moderate, for example. In every country, it's not just in Iran. And again, the key to all of this is really having a sustained dialogue, a sustained interaction, building confidence, building trust, making that eye contact. I mean, even Oman's relationship with Iran was not born yesterday. It is years and years of engagement and conversations and building that trust. It doesn't happen, overnight. Indeed, you mentioned the JCPOA agreement. It was negotiated through engagement, through dialogue, not through confrontation. So I think, even building upon that agreement, we will see what happens, what's the fate of that agreement in the few days to come. But we argue in favor of building upon it and continuing that engagement to address any other concerns of the kind that you've just mentioned. through negotiation, through engagement. It's long-term, it's painstaking, it's not easy, but I think in today, 21st century, we should be talking about dialogue like civilized people, not about confrontation. Confrontation is going to make everyone lose. There's no winner in a confrontation of a military assault. I don't think that is the course or the wise course forward.
Of course, some people would argue that the success of the JCPOA negotiation was a result of the pressure that the international community was able to put on Iran economically, politically, that in a sense forced Iran to come to the negotiating table and seek an agreement, and that if you only relied on a negotiation, the Iranians might never have been interested in actually giving up their nuclear weapons program.
There was pressure on everybody to reach an agreement because the alternative nobody wanted. Surely. There was pressure on Iran, but there were pressures on others. And even that pressure was done peacefully through diplomatic means, through all kinds of other means, and it produced results. Yeah. Yes, but at the end of the day, it was the negotiation and that engagement that really helped put that agreement together.
Let me ask one more question, and then we'll open it up to the audience to invite them to ask questions as well. Last question I'll ask is on the GCC. You made, I think, a very clear statement, and certainly one that I witnessed when I was in Muscat many years ago, of the importance that Oman has always attached to the GCC. I think that we all remember that the Sultan himself was very much involved in promoting the GCC as a military cooperation agreement back in the 1980s and early 1990s. But also, I think in December last year, an unidentified senior Omani official also made a very important observation, gave an important interview about the possibility that Oman is assessing that, in fact, the GCC may not survive, that the way things were going with the confrontation about Qatar, this was soon after the Saudis of the UAE announced that they were going to form their own cooperative agreement, that Oman may be forced to look elsewhere for its cooperation. What is your sense now? We saw Mike Pompeo in Riyadh the other day basically reiterating something along the lines of what you believe of the importance of preserving the GCC as a symbol of, as an articulation of Gulf solidarity. Do you see that the GCC is salvageable right now?
Yes, I think so. I think obviously it takes two to tangle. Everybody needs to galvanize that kind of momentum again. We are committed to the GCC. We don't contemplate leaving it or anything, as I said. We're very much supportive, and we support any effort that will bring an end to the current dispute with Qatar. I think prolonging this dispute is not in the interest of the GCC solidarity. It's not in the interest of the whole region. It undermines an architecture that we have really worked so hard in building over the years. And so we support all our friends' efforts and regional efforts to overcome this very serious crisis. I mean, it's been allowed to become serious with time, and I think the longer it is prolonged, the bad it is for security and stability. So we remain to be committed and hopeful. Okay. We haven't lost hope yet.
Good.
That there will be a solution found.
Good. Okay. Let me ask people, and we have microphones. We have microphones. So please wait when we ask you to speak for a microphone to come. The gentleman in the cap. Please identify yourself.
Good afternoon. Munzir Sulaiman with Al Mayadeen TV. I want to take the opportunity, since we have North Korea situation, to come to the Iran situation from the way that this administration has been approached that issue. And we know that it's no secret that Oman played an important role in the negotiation, mediation between the United States and Iran, and hosted that. Here we have a situation where North Korea have nuclear weapons, could threaten the United States, have missiles that can reach the United States, while Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons and doesn't have missiles that reach the United States. United States is now engaging in a summit with North Korea. Can you assess the possibility of United States engaged with Iran at some point, since you mentioned the issue of containment and other issues did not succeed, and whether Oman would be again play an important role in such negotiation, especially that we are coming in maybe 10, 12 days to a deadline about that issue, and what do you think the impact of withdrawing from the agreement that United States was entered in? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, we are, as I said, very much in favor of engagement. And as now the North Korean example will demonstrate, and we are hopeful, this could be a game changer if these meetings are successful and if the summit between the two presidents creates a breakthrough. It will be a very good example. And I agree with you, if it can be done with North Korea, why not with Iran? So we will continue to argue in favor of engagement at all times. And our role as Oman will always be available should we be asked by any party to help in this process.
Barbara, you have a fan club over here.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General. Thank you, Jerry. I'm Barbara Slavin with the Atlantic Council, and we all appreciate the efforts that you've made on behalf of the Iran nuclear deal. Do you have any kind of contingency planning if the United States pulls out? What are you telling the Iranians in terms of trying to keep them somehow within the agreement? And I'd also be curious about your sense of whether this new condominium of Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the UAE that we see emerging, whether this really has any strong basis or it's just a temporary alignment because of shared concerns about Iran. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, it's a very good question. Both questions are very good. I don't have the answers fully for every question because there are simply unknowns and uncertainties around. And I try to stay as much as possible from hypothetical scenarios. But what I do really hope they will, that the United States will see the wisdom of staying true to that agreement. The whole world is saying this, not just me. Our friends in Europe and elsewhere are arguing in favor of this agreement. And the United States, as a leader of this world, I hope will pay attention to that and listen to that wisdom and really stay together with all of us in supporting this and building upon it. I mean, you know, nothing is perfect. This is not a perfect agreement. We all agree. Nothing is perfect. There'll always be a concern or another about things. But again, I go to the same key point on the central theme of my argument today. We need to stay engaged. Dialogue is very, very powerful. The power of dialogue can really take us a long way for a better future for all of us. This is a very, very important statement, and it's a power to be used effectively for the sake of humanity, for the sake of all of us. This is my recommendation.
Okay. Sir.
Thank you. This is Ambassador Salah Sarhan. I represent the Arab League in Washington. Thank you, Mr. Bousaidi, for your presentation. It's a good one, and it's a very quiet one. As Omani diplomacy, velvet one, we like your, and proud of your diplomacy, Omani diplomacy. My question or my intervention with you now, I heard you are talking, I come from Saudi Arabia, by the way. I represent the Arab League, but I come from Saudi Arabia. I heard you saying about Qatar dispute and Yemeni issues, crisis. And you know what is the role of Arab League and what is the position of Arab League regarding this issue. It's not only Saudi. If we talk about Qatar, we are with the peace, we are with the dialogue, and you know that. But still some requirements. It has to be fulfilled by the Qatar if we come into dialogue with Qatar. So we have some requirement. I can't say it is condition, but it's still requirement. I would like to just bring your attention for that, because it didn't start in your presentation. There's some requirements. Qatar has to be fulfilled. Also regarding the Yemen issue, if we come to dialogue, it's still some conditions, it's still some requirements by some Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, Emirat, and Egypt as well. So we are with the dialogue, we are with the peace, we are with a political solution, but there are some points they have to fulfill it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sheikh Bousaidi.
Thank you. I appreciate your comment, and I understand it fully. And this is why I also said at the outset of my talk, I'm not going to touch upon sensitivities between us as brothers in the GCC or in the Arab League. All I'm saying that all these problems do require a conversation, a credible dialogue. And any dialogue that starts with preconditions, excuse me for saying, I think it's not a dialogue. If you want to have a good, sensible, credible dialogue, we should stay away from any preconditions for a dialogue, because you are already prejudging it before even the dialogue starts. That's all I am saying. Dialogue should be unconditional, because the ultimate and the common objectives of all of us in the region is to reach a solution at the end of the day, a solution that is a win-win solution for all of us. We are all part of one region, we share the same concerns and the same interests, and we better talk with each other without any preconditions to try and reach that ultimate common objectives of peace and stability and harmony.
In the back. Gentleman in the back.
Thank you. Is this working? My name is Dan Silverstein. I'm a private sector strategic advisor. Excellency, are you aware of any practical value that Jared Kushner has brought to any conversation anywhere in the region?
Well, look, I will not really talk about any particular individuals. As I said, we do enjoy a very good relationship with this country, with the United States people, with every administration. This is a very, very long, outstanding and long-standing relationship of friendship that existed since 1833. We hope to maintain it in a positive tone. We hope to be able to give advice whenever we are required to advise on matters that concerns us in our region. We've done this in the past. We will continue to do it should the need arises. And I think, yes, I know the current administration took some bold decisions with regard to the Palestinian issue and the issue of Jerusalem. But at the same time, now that has happened, we can't do much about it, that equally there will be some bold decisions taken by the same administration in pursuit of a resolution of the Palestinian problem and the establishment of a Palestinian state that can honor also all the various resolutions that are associated with this problem. And I hope, the various key leaders in the administration are working on this, and we are yet to hear from them what is in their mind along the path of peace in this region. Thank you.
Yes, over the lady in the red.
Thank you, Your Excellency. A fascinating presentation. My name is Dr. Mindy Reiser. I'm vice president of an NGO called Global Peace Services, USA. There's one country whose name hasn't come up yet. It's a little further from where you are, but the country is Libya. Certainly a country in turmoil. I wonder what thoughts you have as to get a peace process going. Surely your good offices and your diplomatic skills might have something to say.
Thank you, and indeed, I share your concern. The problem in Libya is another complicated and complex one. I think it is still going to be some time before a process can be in place that is credible and that can produce some results. I know there have been continuous efforts, and still are, not just within Libya itself, but among its neighbors in Europe, and of course the Arab League in the Middle East. We've played a bit of a part of that in trying to help them put a constitution together a couple of years ago. But we will continue to offer advice as much as we can. And I think the key, again, for that country, for a solution for Libya, that solution needs to be Libyan-led. It's got to be Libyan-led, and we just cannot impose a particular solution on them. So we need to help Libyan people to really come to terms with their differences and find a path forward for their future. I think the same applies for Syria. We know for Syria we need a Syrian solution, and we can all help in that. But it is also key and crucial for all these problematic areas that the neighbors should be in the same kind of mode of thinking to try and help a country come back together. One of the complicated problems that we have a divided neighborhood and also a divided, probably international community sometimes in addressing some of these problems. So we need a consensus building in favor of a solution for a particular problem such as the one in Libya.
Let's go over here.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your presentation. Zach Gold from the Center for Naval Analyses. Oman has benefited for the past 40-some years from stable, strong leadership but eventually there will be a political transition. And as we've seen with the attempts to interfere in political transitions around the region, how is Oman prepared to push back against attempts from neighboring states or regional states of interfering with your eventual political transition? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, I mean, it's got a little bit hypothetical here, you know, the ifs and buts. But let me assure you that we are confident enough in the capacity of our institutions and systems in Oman to address any Omani challenge or any Omani problems. Oman is a country that goes back deep in history. It's a very, very ancient country with ancient traditions and customs that are, I think, capable in determining the way forward for the Sultanate and its people.
Hamdi Saleh from Egypt. I appreciate very much the gospel you are preaching of love your neighbor. But I thought that, basically this message, particularly because of Oman is friendly of these countries, should be addressed to the three countries who need to love their neighbor, which is Iran, Turkey, and Qatar. These countries have been intervened, and really did a lot of harm to Syria, to Lebanon, to Yemen, to Iraq, to Libya, and to Egypt. Where is the love for your country and their policy? And I think the message and the mission of Oman, which is a great mission, is to really impress this point on them. If there is a need for a dialogue, the need for a dialogue comes from them. Stop talking about the fact that the Iranians saying we control 4 Arab countries, 4 capitals. Can you imagine what kind of dialogue you can have this? If you have a status quo which is balanced against you entirely, where the 3 powers are really interfering in your affairs, creating havoc in 4 countries, then you say dialogue, it's until you get into a balance and a situation which will be even, then you start the dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, but I just want to say one thing. I think, again, I mean, we have learned from our own experiences in Oman over the years that it is a mistake to start blaming anybody. This game of blame is not going to help anybody. That's all I'm going to say.
The young lady in the back.
Hi, Nazanin Suresh with IHS Market. I was hoping you would share your views on the Iran-Houthi relationship and how that configures in a resumption of talks in Yemen. Thank you.
Thank you. The Houthis are Yemenis, above all. I mean, they are not some alien creatures. I mean, they are part of the fabric of the society of Yemen. And clearly, we have seen a civil war within Yemen taking place. And clearly, we have seen, obviously, a military, there's a war going on, in that neighborhood. In that situation, one would expect a particular party to seek any assistance from wherever it can get, because we are in a situation of war, for it to be able to sustain the war efforts. I don't know to what extent that relationship and how strong that relationship is. But even if it exists, I mean, that is not the only reason why we have a war or why there is a problem called the Yemeni problem. Mm-hmm. There are still fundamental issues that needs to be addressed. Again, that is also based on the concept of dialogue that needs to be in place and a political process to be pursued. And a political process cannot be pursued while the war is continuing. So everybody's efforts is really geared of how do we find a way to get a credible ceasefire in place that will allow humanitarian also assistance to flow and allow all these Yemeni players, including Houthis, to come to the negotiating table and forge an understanding and a peace deal among themselves that will address the future. If that is achieved, then there should be no role for any other player in the region. I mean, Yemen is for the Yemenis at the end of the day, and that is what we really want to achieve. And we want to help in that process as much as we can. We are hopeful that the new United Nations envoy can bring fresh momentum to the process. And I think it is being clearly established. And there is no clear military resolution to this problem. It's been going on for more than 3 years. I think it's time to really start working more and more, put more efforts in finding a peaceful way out for all sides, everybody in that conflict.
Okay. Okay, over here. Oh, Steve. Yes. Ambassador Sesh.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. My name is Steve Sesh. I work at the Arab Gulf States Institute. Just a follow-up, I think, to the previous question. I'd like to get your assessment, if I may, please, of the situation that prevails along the Omani-Yemeni border and what you think the likelihood is that Iran is smuggling weapons and ballistic missile component parts across the border to the Houthis.
As far as I am concerned, as far as I know, there is no smuggling of weapons going through the Omani border into Yemen. And if anybody has anything contrary to that, we would welcome any evidence so that we can cooperate and stop it. The border line between Oman and Yemen is a very strong one, and it's quite a vigilant one. It is very difficult to imagine, smuggling taking place through that border. If anything, there could be smuggling taking place from elsewhere. There's an open seas, but certainly not through Oman. I just want to assure you. And this is not the policy of Oman to allow any party to use it as a platform to hurt the interests of any of our neighbors. Period.
Eric?
Eric Polofsky, former member of the National Security Council staff. It's good to see you again. I wondered if you might comment on the nature of the Houthi approach to negotiations going forward, and whether they, after the death of Saleh, have altered their thinking about what a post-conflict Yemen should look like, what their role in Yemen should be. I've heard, obviously, a number of discussions about this subject. Some believe that they want authority without responsibility. Some believe that they don't know what they want. And obviously, Omani diplomacy could be quite useful and effective in guiding their negotiating approach.
We don't really guide them. We can advise only. But we also advise others, not just the Houthis, because our interest really in how do we help create stability for everybody, for the whole of Yemen, and also for maintaining the integrity of that country. I think we share the same objectives with our brothers in Saudi Arabia, that Yemen should remain united and should be peaceful and not pose a threat to any of its neighbors. This is a common objective. From our understanding, when talking with the Houthis, they are open to dialogue, they are open to negotiations, and they want to bring everything to the table of that negotiations. We need to kickstart that negotiation with all of them, and there have been already established guidelines for those negotiations, whether it's the UN Security Council resolutions, whether it's the outcome of the national dialogue that took place before the war and it was agreed. It might need some adjustments now because there have been clearly some new realities on the ground that needs to be taken on board. And there was also the GCC initiatives, which is still something they believe in. So there are elements of a solution that exist. And there is a framework that they have signed to during the previous administration of President Obama, that they have agreed to the framework that was presented to them and signed it off. And so really, there are already ingredients in place that can allow for that process to start. It's just getting the other elements and the other parties to galvanize support for a process of a political process to start among them. But certainly I would say prior to that, we really need to see how we could also bring a credible ceasefire in place, because it's difficult to see how can we get the negotiations up and going while the war is going on and the fighting is going on. I mean, you need to build some element of trust and confidence so everybody feel comfortable to go for the negotiation.
Have you had conversations with Martin Griffiths? Are
Yes.
you optimistic that he's going to be able to get something going this year?
Yes, he has already been once to Oman and had his conversations. And he also met some of the Yemeni representatives in Yemen, and then I think he went to the other countries as well. So we're waiting to hear from him what would be the next step forward. We haven't yet heard anything back.
Okay.
I think he is still waiting for other bits of information and feedback from the other parties, and I think he's in that process at the moment.
Okay, good. Let me go here. Yes. We'll come back, Rich. Yeah.
Robert Mogilnicki from the University of Oxford. One could argue that regional conflicts, specifically the Qatar crisis, have already had tangible economic benefits for Oman. And I'm thinking just specifically about trade volume in the ports of Sohar and Salalah. So I guess my question is, to what degree do economic considerations play in Oman's foreign policy stances?
Well, Oman is, as I said, it's a friend to all and open to business, open for investments, for tourism. We are happy to partner with everybody, really, and happy to help and assist in any way possible. Our basic law, constitution basically of Oman, which was enacted in 1996, actually stipulates in its economic principles the principle of free market. And so if we're able to help and also benefit from the same time, why not? And I really like to use the opportunity to invite anybody who has not been yet to Oman to come and visit us. It's a very hospitable country and friendly. And I'm sure you will have a very, very good time, and maybe there will be opportunities of economic and commercial interests that can evolve from such visits.
One of Anthony Bourdain's favorite places in the world. We'll ask somebody I think you know fairly well, Ambassador Schmier.
Richard Schmier, Middle East Policy Council. Very nice to see you again, Your Excellency. I have some recollection of Oman's previous engagement with Iran and trying to help. I use the word facilitate, not mediate. And two of the strengths that Oman brought to that effort were, one, very, very smart ways of looking for confidence-building measures to allow both sides to develop. And there were many successes along that road. And also there were many occasions when Oman helped Iran, or helped correct misunderstandings that Iran had about the U.S. and our intentions and things like that. Now you happen to have an excellent ambassador in Washington. We now have a new, fairly strong Secretary of State who has the President's ear. So will Oman perhaps be again trying to think of ways to provide some suggestions for confidence-building measures or ways to help Oman better understand some of what's going on here as a means to try to help the kinds of diplomatic engagement that you've described?
Thank you, Ambassador. It's good to see you. I am looking forward to a series of meetings during my visit over today and tomorrow in Washington. I'll be meeting senior personnel officials, representatives in the various agencies here. And no doubt, questions and topics such as Iran will be addressed. We'll be happy to share our views. We're always happy to share our views and offer advice. What is very key in the Omani diplomatic practice and foreign policy that you should understand is that Oman will never impose a particular position. We can lead by example, and we can offer advice. And we are happy to assist in any way possible. This is really the principles that guide our role diplomatically and politically, and this has always been the case. In fact, this is a very traditional, ancient policy of ours. And we'll stick to it because it works best for us.
Okay. We might have time for one more question. In the back, in the very back.
Thank you. Yara Bayumi from Reuters. I had a couple of questions. One, you, sir, were talking about the value of quiet diplomacy and what that achieves. That was also something that we'd certainly seen from the Gulf generally for the over time, but obviously we've seen a shift in that in the last couple of years from specific parties within the Gulf who have obviously not gone down the quiet diplomacy route and have taken a much more assertive and aggressive foreign policy. To what extent do you think that has contributed to the destabilization in the region? And then my second question is following up on the economic question. I mean, Oman is suffering from a very significant budget deficit. To what extent, again, do you see your position, your neutrality position that you advocate, your quiet diplomacy, has that in any way affected possibly gaining some kind of financing from your Gulf neighbors because of these positions that you've taken? Thank you.
Thank you again. All your questions are very good and intelligent. Difficult to answer in a nutshell, but let me try. First of all, I mean, we do really understand and do respect also some of the positions taken by some of our neighbors. Whether or not they contributed to instability or stability, that remains to be seen. I mean, we are going through quite a turbulent period for various reasons, multiple reasons. Some are historic, as I said in my presentation. But we do wish our neighbors all the best. We do love our neighbors, genuinely do. I mean, we wish them well. their stability is important for our stability. And I like to think vice versa too. We all share that region, we are part of that region. And I think all I'm saying, really, the point back again is that we need to really intensify our conversations and dialogue, because there are some pressing issues currently we are going through, such as the one the GCC is going through, and that needs dialogue, that needs real serious dialogue among us to overcome these problems. Economically speaking, yes, I mean, Oman is not the only country. All the oil-producing countries are going through a difficult time because of the oil price and so on, although it's sort of somewhat recovered recently. I hope it continues to recover. But Oman is pushing forward very, very much hard in its diversification policy of the economy, like everyone else also around us. I think this is a lesson that we should finally and fully learn from, and how we can diversify away from oil to sustain progress and growth for our economy, for our people. I think we will be able to do that over time. I know it's going to be, or it has been quite difficult. It's going to be a bit difficult, rough period. But I believe in our capacity to tolerate this and overcome it with time, as people also get used to the idea of the new ways of doing things. It will be a little bit painful, but that is to be expected, and we need to communicate this better to the young people in particular, so that there is a real partnership between government and private sector, between everybody, to really pull together as a country to overcome this difficult phase. And I'm very much confident and very optimistic about the future.
Thank you so much for coming and spending this time with us. I think that once again you've articulated what we've all come to know and understand about Oman, the very positive, constructive role that Oman has played historically for these past nearly 50 years that the Sultan has been on the throne, and the important role that Oman has played, as Wendy said, a small country that plays an outsized role and responsibility in regional and global affairs. So thank you so much for joining us today, and we wish you every success in your discussions.
Thank you. Thank you.